My name is Mary. I'm 63 years old and I live alone now. My husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago, leaving me with a house that's too big for one person and a life that feels strangely empty without him. I've spent my days keeping the house in order, tending to the garden, and filling the quiet with whatever small tasks I can find. The silence sometimes presses in, and I find myself longing for the sound of Robert's voice or the way his laugh would fill a room. It's funny how life goes on, even when you feel like it shouldn't. They say time heals all wounds, but that's not entirely true. The wound just becomes something you learn to live with. I've learned to keep myself busy, but the ache, the absence of him, never really goes away. I don't have many people around anymore. Robert was the social one. I was the one who stayed in the background, quietly observing, supporting. Our circle of friends has thinned out, and now it's just me. But I do have one person, and that's my son, Peter. He's 39 years old, married with two children of his own. We don't see each other often. The distance has grown, not physically, but emotionally. I guess that's what happens when your child grows up, builds his own life. There are phone calls, sometimes a visit, but mostly it's just the occasional check-in. Peter was always close to Robert, a little more than he was with me, but that was all right. They had their bond, and I respected that. I did what I could to support him, paid for his college, helped with his first apartment. There was nothing I wouldn't do for him, my only child. I wanted him to have everything I could give him, even though I knew Robert and I weren't rich. But love and support don't cost money. I didn't always agree with the way he lived his life. He had big dreams, big plans, and sometimes those plans felt like they were on the edge of something reckless. But he's my son. I've always trusted him, even when I didn't fully understand everything he was doing. When he decided to start his own business, a coffee shop he called it, I was there for him. I invested a little here, a little there, like a good mother would. Nothing major. I knew he would make it work. After all, he always said, "Mom, you're our reliable backup." Those words were a comfort, and they made me feel important, like I still had a purpose. Life had settled into a rhythm, the quiet mornings, the occasional phone calls from Peter. I thought that was how it would be from now on. But then came that day. The day everything changed. It wasn't anything special at first. Peter called me one morning, asking if I could help him with something. His voice was cheerful, but there was a slight edge to it that I didn't quite recognize. "Hey, Mom, got a minute? I need a favor." I'm used to Peter's requests. They're usually small, maybe an errand or a loan here and there. Nothing too big, just little things that add up over time. I always said yes because that's what mothers do, right? "Of course. What do you need?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "It's just a formality, really. You know how we're trying to get the loan for the coffee shop? Well, the bank's asking for one more thing. They need a signature to finalize the application. It's nothing major, just a guarantee, and it'll help us secure the loan." I didn't think twice about it. I trusted Peter. He wouldn't ask me for something unless it was absolutely necessary. We'd been through so much together, and he'd never given me any reason to doubt him. Besides, he sounded confident. If this was the final step to securing the loan for his business, I wanted to help. I wanted him to succeed. So, I agreed. "All right, Peter, I'll be happy to help. Just send the document over, and I'll sign it." He was on the phone with me for another few minutes, giving me all the details. I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. Then he said, "Thanks, Mom. I'll be over to pick it up later today. Don't worry about reading it. It's just a formality, like I said." I didn't think anything of it. It was a simple document after all. I didn't need to read it. I trusted him. And besides, I didn't think for a second that anything could go wrong. Later that afternoon, Peter came by to pick up the papers. He had a big smile on his face, looking as confident as ever. He handed me the document, and without hesitation, I signed it. A quick scribble on the dotted line, just as he asked. That was it. I thought I was done. I thought everything was in place. You're the best, Mom, he said, kissing me on the cheek before leaving. I smiled, feeling good about helping him once again. Little did I know that signature would be the beginning of something I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. That night, everything seemed normal. I went to bed, content with the thought that I had done something good for my son. But the next morning, my world was turned upside down. I received a call from the bank. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. Mrs. Harrison, the voice said, we're calling to inform you that your loan payment is overdue. You are listed as the guarantor, and we've not received the payment for the business loan. I sat up straight in bed, my heart racing. What loan? I don't have any loans. The voice continued, unfazed. The loan for the coffee shop, Mrs. Harrison. It's due in full, and you are the guarantor. We need to speak to you about the overdue payment. I could feel my pulse quicken. I had no idea what they were talking about. I hadn't taken out a loan. I wasn't involved in any business transactions. This was a mistake. I think you've got the wrong person, I said, trying to remain calm. But the voice didn't change. I'm afraid not, Mrs. Harrison. Your son, Peter Harrison, took out the loan. You are listed as the guarantor, and the payments are overdue. If we don't receive the payment immediately, we'll have to take further action. I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know about this, I stammered. No one told me about any loan. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then the voice said, I suggest you contact your son. We'll be expecting payment soon. The call ended. I sat there for a long time, in shock. How could this have happened? Peter hadn't told me about any loan. He had asked me to sign a document, yes, but I never imagined it would come to this. My mind raced as I tried to process what I'd just heard. A loan? For $380,000? And I was the guarantor? I tried calling Peter, but he didn't pick up. I called again and again, nothing. My heart sank. What had I done? I had trusted him. I had always trusted him. But now I was left to deal with the consequences. I spent the rest of the morning in a haze. The phone call from the bank kept replaying in my mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. How could I have been so naive? How could I have trusted Peter so completely? The signature I had given him, the one I thought was a simple formality, now felt like the weight of a boulder on my chest. I needed answers. Without thinking too much, I grabbed my purse and keys and left the house, heading to Peter's. The drive felt endless, every minute stretching into an eternity as I tried to process what I was about to face. When I arrived, his house seemed oddly quiet, the blinds drawn and the front door locked. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, I knocked, but there was no answer. My heart pounded, and I realized I hadn't even thought to check if he was home before coming here. Maybe he was at work, or I shook the thought away. I couldn't let myself think like that. I needed to see him. I needed to understand what was going on. I tried calling him again, but once again, the phone rang unanswered. Desperation started creeping into my chest. Something wasn't right. Something was horribly wrong. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand gripping the cold metal of the door handle, before I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind me. I turned to find Peter's wife, Jenna, walking up the driveway, her face lit by a forced smile. Mom, hey, what's going on? She didn't seem concerned, but her tone was more casual than I expected, given the circumstances. Peter's not here. He's on a business trip, actually. He left this morning. I didn't know how to respond. Peter was on a trip. This wasn't the first time, and I'd grown used to his unpredictable schedule. But right now, all I could think about was the conversation with the bank. I need to talk to him. It's important, I said, my voice shaking. It's about the loan. At the mention of the loan, Jenna's smile faltered. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, but then, to my surprise, she said, "Well, Peter's been really busy with the shop. I'm sure he'll get around to explaining it all to you when he gets back. Everything's fine. Don't worry." Her words felt too rehearsed, too smooth, and I could tell she was trying to keep me calm, but her calmness only made my gut churn with unease. There was something in her eyes, something guarded, that made my blood run cold. "Jenna," I said, my voice suddenly stern, "I need to know what's going on. The bank called me. I'm listed as a guarantor for a loan. Why didn't Peter tell me about this?" Her face paled slightly. It was the first sign that she wasn't as unaffected as she appeared. It's, it's just a formality," she stammered, avoiding my gaze. "Peter needed the loan to cover some extra expenses for the business, but it's all under control, Mary. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. You don't need to worry about it." I didn't buy it, not for a second. Without saying another word, I stepped past her and walked into the house, my hand still clutching my purse. I wasn't going to stand here and let her talk me down. I needed to understand this. I needed to know what I had signed up for. Jenna hesitated, but then followed me inside. I walked straight to the living room, taking a seat on the couch. She lingered in the doorway, watching me with a nervous expression, her hands folded in front of her. "You know, I think it would be better if you wait for Peter to get back," she said, her voice cautious. "He'll be the one to explain everything." But I wasn't going to wait. I wasn't going to let this slide anymore. "I need to see the documents, the ones Peter gave me to sign," I said, my voice tight. "I need to see the loan agreement." Jenna hesitated, biting her lip. "It's not necessary, Mary," she said, her tone becoming more insistent. "We've already gone through all of that, and there's no reason for you to get involved in the details." I felt a chill run down my spine. She was hiding something. I could feel it. "I'm getting involved now," I replied, my voice sharp. "Either you get me those papers, or I'll go to the bank and sort this out myself." For a moment, she didn't speak. She looked down at her hands, as if debating something in her mind. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she walked over to a small desk by the window and opened a drawer. She retrieved a manila envelope and handed it to me, her eyes not meeting mine. I opened the envelope slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was the loan agreement Peter had asked me to sign. I skimmed through the pages quickly, my eyes moving from line to line, trying to understand the terms, but what I saw made my stomach churn. The loan wasn't just for the coffee shop. The amount wasn't just a small business loan, as I had assumed. No, it was much larger, $380,000, and I was listed as the guarantor. I looked up at Jenna, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't Peter tell me about this? Why didn't he explain any of this to me?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered in her throat. I could tell she was struggling, trying to find the right thing to say. But whatever she was going to say next was drowned out by the feeling in my chest, a feeling that settled like ice. Peter had lied to me. He had used me as collateral without even telling me, and now I was left to clean up the mess. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply put the papers down on the table, stood up, and walked out the door. I didn't need to say anything else. I knew what I had to do next. I went home and sat in the quiet of my living room, letting the weight of everything sink in. I didn't feel anger, not yet. What I felt was a deep, cold sense of betrayal. Peter, my only son, had left me to bear the weight of his reckless decisions, And I was the one who would have to pay the price. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I would find a way to fix this, a way to protect myself. And when I was done, no one would ever underestimate me again. The house felt colder than usual that evening. I stood in my living room, staring at the loan documents, the words blurring as I read them over and over again. I had trusted Peter. I had always trusted him. But now, as I sat there, it was hard to reconcile the image of my son, the boy I had raised, with the person who had manipulated me into signing a financial death sentence for him. I had to make sense of it all, but where to start? The first thing was to understand the full scope of the mess he had gotten us into. It took a few hours, but I finally managed to regain my composure. I sat down at my desk, fired up the old laptop, and began searching for answers. I knew very little about business law or financial jargon, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. This wasn't just about money, it was about principle. I started with the company name listed on the loan documents. I typed it into the search engine, my fingers trembling as I pressed enter. The first few results didn't seem to match. Then I found something, a link to a local business registry. It didn't take long for the details to emerge. The company Peter and Jenna had been involved with was not a small coffee shop as they'd led me to believe. No, it was far bigger than that. It was a shell company with a network of debts extending far beyond what was listed on the loan agreement. The business they were supposedly running had liabilities to multiple creditors, none of whom seemed to have been informed of the true state of things. Peter had presented this to me as an innocuous loan for a small venture, but it was clear now that it was part of a larger scheme to cover up mounting debts. As I clicked through the pages of information, it became increasingly apparent that Peter's business dealings were far more complex and more dishonest than I could have ever imagined. I read through more documents, feeling my stomach sink lower with each click. There were unpaid invoices, falsified reports, and creditors who had long been ignored. Peter had been taking risks with other people's money and using my good name to shield himself from the fallout. My hands were shaking as I absorbed the full extent of the deception. My son had taken advantage of me, of my trust, to leverage me into a financial position that left me vulnerable. And the worst part? He hadn't even bothered to tell me the truth. I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning. I felt a mix of rage and disbelief, but no tears came. This wasn't the time for emotion. I had to think logically. I had to figure out how to protect myself, and, if I was being honest, how to make sure Peter paid for what he had done. I couldn't just march in and confront him. Peter was a master of deflection, of making people believe what he wanted them to believe. If I went to him directly now, he'd twist the situation, convince me that I was overreacting, that it was all a misunderstanding, and that everything would be fine once he returned. No, I needed to get ahead of this. I needed to control the narrative, just as he had tried to control mine. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me any longer. The next morning, I went to see Mr. Tiller, the lawyer who had helped me with my husband's will. I trusted him. He had been my husband's lawyer for years, and I knew he would handle things with professionalism and discretion. I arrived at his office, my thoughts as sharp as ever, and I took a seat in his office. "Mary, what brings you here today?" Mr. Tiller asked, his deep voice calm and reassuring as always. I placed the loan documents on his desk without saying a word. He looked at them, then back at me, sensing the gravity of the situation before he even glanced at the details. This, this is quite serious," he said after a moment, flipping through the papers slowly. "It looks like your son has involved you in a very risky situation. These documents, they're not just loans, Mary. They're part of a much larger financial scheme, the kind of thing that could leave you liable for more than just the debt." My throat tightened. "I know," I replied. I had no idea it would be this bad. I signed without understanding the full extent of it. Mr. Tiller nodded gravely. I see. Well, I've worked with many people in your position. The first thing we need to do is protect you legally. We need to ensure that you're not held liable for any of the debts. I can help you with that, Mary, but you'll need to act quickly. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. This was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult road. I had been used, manipulated, and left vulnerable, but no one would get away with this. Not Peter, not Jenna, not anyone. I want to revoke the power of attorney, I said suddenly, my voice steady but firm. And I want to change the will. I'm not leaving anything to chance. I want full control of everything from now on. Mr. Tiller raised an eyebrow, impressed by my resolve. You're thinking strategically. That's exactly what you need to do. I spent the next hour with him, going through the details of the paperwork. We discussed my options, my rights, and the best course of action. He advised me to file a fraud report, which I agreed to do. As we finished up, I felt a new sense of calm settle over me. I had a plan. I was no longer a victim. I was taking control of the situation. Before I left, Mr. Tiller made me promise one thing. Don't act in haste. Make sure you have all your ducks in a row before confronting Peter. He's likely to try to manipulate you again. I won't act in haste, I assured him. This time I'll be ready. I walked out of his office with a quiet determination. The next steps were clear. I needed to take back what was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own son, take that from me. I had been blindsided, but now I was the one calling the shots. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. I had taken the first step, but there was still so much to do. Mr. Tiller had been invaluable in helping me sort through the legalities, but it was up to me to follow through. There was no room for mistakes, no time for hesitation. My son had made his move, and now it was my turn. The power of attorney was the first thing I revoked. It had been a mistake to give him that level of control in the first place, but it was easy to do when you trusted someone blindly. I could see now how foolish I had been, but I wasn't going to beat myself up about it. I would just fix it. The paperwork was straightforward enough, but it still took a few days for everything to be processed. That was fine. I had time. I could be patient. The house, the one my husband and I had bought when Peter was still a little boy, was my most important asset. It was all I had left now. My son had taken so much from me already, and the thought that he might take the house too was unbearable. I had been living in this house alone since my husband died, and it had always been a place of comfort, of memories. I wasn't about to let him take that away from me. I called my lawyer again, and we began the process of rewriting the deed. It was all so technical, so mechanical, but I didn't mind. This was a task I could handle. It wasn't emotional. It was a matter of securing what was rightfully mine. While the legal work was being processed, I filed the fraud report as I had planned. I made sure I had copies of every document: the loan agreement, Peter's correspondence, the online findings about his company, and the fraudulent way he had used my name. I had all the evidence I needed, and I wasn't going to let him wriggle out of this. He had deceived me, and now it was time to return the favor. But there was one more thing I needed to do. Peter's wife, Jenna, was innocent in all this, at least as far as I could tell. I had no reason to believe she was involved in the scheme. She was just another victim of Peter's manipulation. But that didn't mean I trusted her. No, I needed to have a conversation with her. I needed to make sure she understood that the game had changed. She might not have been aware of what Peter was doing, but she was about to learn a harsh lesson in loyalty. I arranged a meeting with her for the following week. I knew it was risky. She was, after all, still married to Peter, and I had no idea how she would react when she learned that I was now the one in control. But it was necessary. I couldn't just let this slide, not without ensuring I had all my ducks in a row. The day before our meeting, I prepared everything. I gathered the documents, the revised deed, the fraud report, the loan agreement, and placed them neatly in a folder. I needed to be calm and collected. This wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't about anger or accusations. This was about control. The next morning, I left for her house. The drive there was a quiet one. I had no anxiety, just a quiet focus. When I arrived, she greeted me at the door with a polite smile, but I could see the tension in her eyes. I could tell she had heard some rumors, perhaps even about the loan, though she didn't say anything directly. We went to the kitchen, where I took a seat at the table. I could hear the sound of the kettle boiling in the background, but neither of us moved to make tea. There was no need. The silence between us was thick, but not uncomfortable. I laid the documents out in front of her, watching her eyes flicker from the papers to my face. "I'm not suing you," I began, my voice steady. "But I need you to understand something. I am now the owner of Peter's company." I paused, letting that sink in. Through a figurehead, of course, but I'm in charge now. Her face shifted, disbelief creeping into her expression. You can't," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I nodded slowly. "I can, and I will." She looked down at the documents, scanning the pages, her fingers hovering over the lines as if she could read them without really understanding. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice now tinged with frustration. "I'm not going to sue you," I repeated, though this time my tone had a hint of finality. "But you need to decide where your loyalty lies. If you want to keep your husband out of trouble, you'll need to play by my rules. I've been patient, Jenna, but I'm done waiting. You can either be a partner in this business or I'll take it all down with one move." She sat back, visibly shaken by my words. I didn't need to explain myself further. She knew what was at stake. Her silence spoke volumes. A few moments passed before she spoke again, her voice small. "What do you want from me, exactly?" I gave her a hard look. "I want you to understand. Peter has made a lot of mistakes, but you can still salvage what's left. If you don't, if you try to stop me now, everything he's worked for, everything he thinks he can hide, will come crashing down. This is your chance to make it right." She was quiet for a long time, but eventually she nodded. "I understand," she said quietly, and that was all. I stood up, collected the documents, and placed them back in my bag. "Good. I'll be in touch soon," I said as I walked toward the door. I left her house without looking back. The pieces were in place now. The game had shifted, and I was no longer the pawn. I was the one in control, and I wasn't going to let Peter, nor anyone else, take that from me. A week passed before I had to make my next move. It wasn't that I was waiting. I was making sure every detail was in order. The house was now fully in my name, and the fraudulent loan had been reported to the authorities. The power of attorney had been revoked, and I was no longer legally tied to Peter in the way I had been before. Everything was falling into place. The day I had been preparing for arrived, and I felt calm, not angry, not anxious, just focused. I had made the decision that I would be strategic about everything, no outbursts, no impulsive actions. It was time to speak to Jenna, and I knew this was my opportunity to secure the next step. I arrived at her house early in the afternoon. She opened the door with the same hesitant smile she had when I visited before. But today, I didn't have the same doubts. I wasn't here as a victim. I was here as someone with a plan. We sat down in the kitchen once again. The house was quiet. No kids running around. No sounds of busy life. It felt like a house waiting for something. But it wasn't the calm before a storm. It was just a house, and that's what I needed it to feel like. There was no rush, no emotion, just the need to get this right. Jenna set a cup of tea in front of me, but neither of us touched it. She knew why I was here, and she was smart enough to know that things were no longer as simple as before. The first conversation was just an introduction. Today, we would get down to business. I placed the documents on the table between us again, but this time I also pulled out the revised business agreement. It wasn't long, but it was clear and direct. It outlined everything: her role as a partner, the shares, the management structure. There were no loopholes, no gray areas. Jenna, I began, my voice steady and clear, I've already done what I need to do to secure the business. You have a choice. You can be a partner or you can walk away. But if you choose to walk away, there's no turning back. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, making sure she knew I was serious. If you walk away, Peter's business will collapse, and he'll go to jail. I'll make sure of it. I've been patient, but if you want any part of this, you need to sign this agreement. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I could see her mind working, weighing the consequences. She knew that signing would make her complicit in something she likely didn't understand at first. She also knew that if she chose not to sign, she'd be throwing everything away and likely losing her husband in the process. I don't know what to say, she muttered, more to herself than to me. You don't need to say anything, I replied. Just sign the document. It's simple. Her fingers hovered over the contract for a moment. Then slowly, she picked up the pen and began to sign her name at the bottom of the page. I watched her hand move, steady despite the trembling I could sense beneath the surface. She was taking the deal because, as much as she hated it, she knew there was no other choice. When she finished, she pushed the document toward me, looking at me with a strange mixture of relief and resignation. It's done, she said quietly. Her voice wasn't triumphant, but it wasn't filled with anger either. It was the voice of someone who had accepted the inevitability of the situation. I took the document, carefully folded it, and placed it back into my bag. I didn't need to say anything more. There was nothing left to discuss. I had what I needed. I had the upper hand, and I would use it to ensure my future and the future of my home. I stood up, ready to leave, but before I could walk out the door, she stopped me with a question. Mary, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, are you doing the right thing? I paused. It wasn't the question I had expected, but I understood it. It wasn't about the business or Peter. It was about me. And she was asking me if I was at peace with the choices I had made. I turned to face her. Jenna, I said slowly, my voice calm, I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I'm doing this to protect myself. I trusted Peter. I trusted him with everything. But trust doesn't mean letting someone take advantage of you. She didn't respond, but I could see that she understood. There was nothing else to say. The deal was done. I'll be in touch, I said, and then I left, walking out the door without another glance back. I felt lighter as I drove home. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but I had taken another step. One more part of the plan was in place. There were still things to do, more moves to make, but I was no longer the victim. I was the one controlling the game, and that was a feeling I wasn't going to lose. A week had passed since the meeting with Jenna, and everything was coming together. The house was secure, the documents were signed, and I was officially a part owner of Peter's business. It felt surreal, almost as if it were someone else's life I was living. But this wasn't a dream, and there was no going back. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The next step was clear. I would take my position as an investor seriously. The office was still buzzing with the same nervous energy I had felt when I first walked in. The same employees, the same outdated furniture, the same disorganized chaos. Peter's absence was palpable, though no one knew exactly where he had gone. No one seemed to notice me at first. I wasn't the flashy investor that people expected. I wasn't there to make grand gestures or shake up the company right away. I was there to ensure things went according to plan. I had spent the past few days organizing the financials, going through every spreadsheet, every contract, and every loose end that Peter had left behind. The first thing I did was meet with the accountant and reviewed the books. They were a mess. Peter had been skimming off the top, using company funds for personal expenses, leaving the business struggling under mountains of debt. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was how everyone else seemed completely oblivious to the true state of the company. When I walked into the office that morning, I was ready to make my presence known. No one had expected me, and no one knew exactly what to think when I arrived. I was calm, collected, and confident. I didn't need to make a dramatic entrance. I just needed to show them that I was in charge now. I took my seat in the small meeting room where the management team typically gathered. I wasn't going to waste any time. I had one goal: to regain control of the company, stabilize it, and make sure Peter couldn't use it to his advantage again. The team sat across from me, exchanging uncertain glances. They didn't know who I was, or at least they didn't know my true role. They probably thought I was just another investor, a silent partner, someone who had the money but no real involvement. They were wrong. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice calm but firm. "I'm Mary. I'm your new partner, and I'm here to make sure we get this company back on track." There were no gasps, no immediate reactions, just silence, followed by a few uneasy glances. I knew they had questions, and I was prepared to answer them on my terms. "I've reviewed the financials," I continued, "and it's clear that there are significant issues we need to address immediately. We'll start with cutting down on unnecessary expenses. I'll also be looking into all the contracts you have in place with suppliers and customers. Nothing is off limits." One of the managers, a young man with a nervous twitch, raised his hand. "But Mary, what about Peter? Is he coming back?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Peter is no longer in charge," I said, not flinching. "I'm the one making decisions now." The room was still, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads. They were trying to piece everything together. Who was I? Why was I here? What did I want? And most importantly, what did this mean for them? I wasn't going to answer all their questions immediately. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I let them stew on it for a while, giving them time to come to terms with the fact that I was the one in charge now. I wasn't there to play games, and I wasn't there to entertain their questions. I had a job to do, and I intended to do it well. The next few days were spent in meetings with lawyers, accountants, and other business experts. I was methodical, going through every detail, every possible angle. The company had debts, many of them, but there was also a lot of untapped potential. If I could stabilize it, if I could manage to make the right moves, I could not only pay off the loan, but make this business more profitable than it had ever been under Peter's control. But the most important thing was making sure Peter wouldn't have the chance to take it all away from me. He had already tried once, and I wasn't going to let him do it again. A week after my arrival, I made another visit to the office. This time, I was more confident. I was no longer just a silent partner. I was a force to be reckoned with. And when I walked into the building, people took notice. I had begun to put the pieces in motion, restructuring deals, renegotiating terms, and cutting dead weight. By the end of the week, the rent for the office had been redirected. The company's funds were now flowing in a different direction, toward paying off the loan. Every dollar that Peter had once thought was his, every penny that he had used to cover up his mistakes, was now being redirected. No more hiding behind false pretenses. No more trying to steal from me. Every bit of it was going into settling the debt he had created. I wasn't in this to punish people for their mistakes. I was in it to make sure no one took what was mine. And now that I was in control, I made sure that Peter would never be able to come back and ruin everything again. I had a long road ahead of me, but it was a road that I was more than prepared to travel. It was my road now. The game had changed, and I was no longer just a player. I was the one calling the shots, and I had every intention of winning. The days had blended together since I took control of the business. I had been relentless in my pursuit of securing everything that had once been at risk. Every time I stepped into the office, I felt a little more in command, a little more like I belonged there. It wasn't the same office I had once visited as a mere observer. It was mine now, and it was my responsibility. The employees, though unsure at first, had begun to adjust to the new order. They respected me now, not because I was someone they had to fear, but because they knew I was competent. I knew how to make decisions, how to turn a situation around. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to make sure the company survived and thrived. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and phone calls. Every decision, no matter how small, seemed to matter more than it ever had before. I felt the weight of the loan on my shoulders, but at the same time, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. It wasn't just about paying off the debt anymore. It was about reclaiming my life and my dignity. And yet, amid all the changes, there was one thing I hadn't counted on. One morning, as I was wrapping up a phone call with a supplier, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? Mom, my son's voice came through tentative and distant. Can we have dinner together? I froze, staring at the screen, trying to process what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, after all the lies and betrayal, he was asking to meet, to have dinner. I hadn't heard from him since he'd vanished with his wife, leaving me to clean up the mess he had made. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. My emotions had been steady for weeks now. There was no room for surprise or anger anymore, only control, precision, and purpose. No, Peter, I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. I'm busy. I run a business now. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him trying to find the words, trying to figure out what I meant. I I didn't think. He trailed off, his voice almost sounding apologetic, but it was too late for apologies. I let the silence stretch, knowing it was uncomfortable, knowing it was exactly what he needed to feel. I'll be fine, I said finally, my words quiet but firm. This time, I've made sure of it. You should have thought about that before. I ended the call without another word. I didn't need to explain myself any further. I had done everything I needed to do. The business was running smoothly, the debts were being paid off, and the loan was slowly shrinking with each passing month. But more than that, I had taken control. I had turned the tables on Peter, on the whole situation, and had created a future where I didn't need anyone's help. I was no longer the vulnerable woman he had taken advantage of. I was the one who held the cards now. Later that evening, as I sat at my desk, the sun setting outside the window, I thought about everything that had happened. I'd gone from being betrayed and humiliated to being the one who had rewritten the rules of the game. And now, I wasn't just the one who had survived. I was the one in charge. Peter's call, though unexpected, was a reminder of just how much had changed. I ran my fingers over the contracts on my desk, the ones that had solidified my place in the business. They were the same contracts that once made me feel small and powerless, but now they felt like weapons. Each signature I had put down, each decision I had made, had led to this point. I was no longer just a participant in the game. I was the one who had mastered it. And as I sat there, surrounded by the papers and the contracts that represented my newfound power, I smiled. I was no longer his backup. I was no longer the woman who had been taken advantage of. I had turned the tables. Peter had thought he could leave me homeless, trick me into signing away my security. He had underestimated me. Now I was the one who had made the rules. I was the one in control. And I didn't need anyone to remind me of that. The game had changed, and this time I had won.